At Deirdre's retirement dinner in April, Monica stood between the salad course and the main to toast her mother. She said, and I remember this clearly because I wrote it down when I got home, that her mother had earned every single thing she owned over 30 years in pharmaceutical sales, that her retirement security was sacred, and that anyone who expected Deirdre to reach into her own assets for someone else's benefit simply didn't understand what real hard work looked like. Everyone at the table applauded. I applauded too. 3 weeks later, Monica sat at my kitchen table in Dundas with a printed appraisal of my bungalow and a home equity line of credit application already filled in with my name and address. She wanted $60,000 toward a down payment. She wanted me to borrow against the house Earl and I had paid off 17 years ago. I did not raise my voice. At 63, after 29 years as the head librarian at a secondary school in Hamilton, and 5 years learning how to live in a house that felt too quiet, I knew the weight of every payment we had ever made on that property. I was not about to explain that to Monica, but I am getting ahead of myself. I have a good life. The bungalow sits at the end of a wide crescent in Dundas, backed against the Niagara Escarpment, with a backyard long enough that Earl was able to build a proper detached workshop before his heart gave out 4 winters ago. He was a woodworker by disposition and a long-haul driver by employment, and that workshop was the place he was most fully himself. Since he died, I have used it for furniture restoration, stripping and refinishing pieces I find at estate sales, then reselling them at the Hamilton Antique Market or to a small circle of interior designers who began calling me after word got around. I also own a cargo van, a used one I bought from the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board auction when they cleared their fleet. I need it to haul dressers and sideboards, and the occasional armoire. Together, the workshop and the van were the working parts of a small business I had built quietly, on my own terms, in the years since Earl was gone. Drew, my son, knew all of this. He was 33, a project coordinator for a construction management firm in Burlington, steady and sensible in the way he had always been before he married Monica. Even after, there were moments, brief, like October's sun through cloud, when I could see that steadiness still in him. Monica was 31. She worked in brand marketing, specifically what she called experiential activations, which as far as I understood meant organizing corporate events and pop-up promotional installations for clients. She was quick and ambitious and spent considerable energy maintaining the impression that she and Drew lived more prosperously than they did. The weekend yoga retreats, the subscription meal kit boxes, the brunch spots along Lock Street, all of it photographed and shared online. Meanwhile, Drew had mentioned, more than once in passing, that their rent in Waterdown had gone up 14% at renewal, and that the car payments were structured in a way that didn't leave much margin. I was not unsympathetic to any of that. Southern Ontario was an unforgiving place to build a life in your 30s. I understood that genuinely. What I found harder to understand was why Monica looked at Earl's workshop and my cargo van and saw them as natural solutions to problems she and Drew had largely created through their own spending choices. It started the way these arrangements always start, with something reasonable. In the spring of their second married year, Monica asked if she could use my workshop on a Saturday to assemble event signage for a corporate activation she was coordinating. Just once, she said, she needed somewhere with space and good light. I said yes. It happened 3 more times that season. By the following year, she had begun referring to my workshop in her client emails as a prep and staging studio in Dundas, and I came home from the antique market one Saturday to find 2 large plastic totes of branded merchandise stacked against the wall beside my refinishing table. No message, no key returned on the hook, just boxes where my supplies had been shifted aside to make room. The van followed a similar path. Drew mentioned he was thinking about picking up some side work, moving furniture on weekends. Could he borrow the van on Saturdays? I said yes twice, and a third time when he mentioned Monica needed it to transport event equipment to a client site in Ancaster. The third time, the van came back on a Sunday evening with a half tank of fuel, a new scuff along the rear left panel, and a receipt from a Tim Hortons in Stony Creek tucked in the cup holder, which told me the route had been considerably longer than Ancaster. I raised it gently, the way you do when you are trying to preserve something. Drew apologized sincerely. Monica was quiet for a moment and then said I was being a little precious about a scratch on a van I'd bought secondhand from a school board. That particular turn of phrase told me what I needed to know. The word that crystallized the situation came a month later at Sunday dinner. I had made roast chicken and a potato gratin using Earl's recipe, and somewhere between the main course and the apple crisp, the conversation turned to a neighbor down the road who had installed a garden suite without going through the city. Monica had opinions. People treat their property like it belongs to them exclusively and forever, she said, reaching across for more gratin without asking. It's a very boomer mentality, honestly. Sitting on resources while people around you struggle is just a form of hoarding. The workshop, for example. You use it, 3 or 4 times a month? The rest of the time it's just locked up doing nothing. Drew turned his wine glass slowly on the tablecloth. I observed the careful neutrality in his posture, the practiced stillness of a man who had learned not to disagree in front of witnesses. My workshop is where I run my business, I said pleasantly, and the van is my primary work vehicle. It sits in the driveway most of the week, Monica said. Underutilized capital, there's a real cost to that. I looked at the bottle of wine she'd brought, a Niagara Peninsula Pinot Noir from a winery I knew the price point of, and I kept my expression still. I cleared the dessert plates and said dinner was winding down. Neither of them offered to help. After they left, I stood at my kitchen sink looking out at the workshop, where the Victorian secretary desk I was refinishing for a client in Ancaster sat half-stripped under a drop cloth. I did not feel angry. I felt something quieter and more useful than anger. I felt clear. The following week, I made 2 calls. The first was to a woman from the Hamilton Artisan Collective who had been asking for months whether I would consider running a monthly furniture refinishing course in my space. I confirmed the dates and the participant numbers, 12 per session, starting the first Saturday of every month. The second call was to a locksmith. I had the workshop rekeyed and a digital keypad deadbolt installed. Drew had always kept a physical key on his ring. That key no longer worked. I did not announce this to anyone. I also contacted a small moving company I knew through the antique market circuit. They needed a reliable cargo van with an insured driver for Thursday and Friday deliveries during their busy period. We agreed on a weekly rate, signed a straightforward agreement, and I set up a drop box by the side door for their signed logbook and the rental check. My assets were no longer sitting idle as open invitations. They were committed to purposeful, compensated work. Drew called on a Friday evening. His voice had the careful brightness of someone tasked with an unpleasant errand. Monica was planning a staging setup for a client event on the 17th, he said. She had figured she could bring the equipment to my workshop the Saturday before to start prepping. She had told the client the space was available. The workshop is booked that weekend, I told him. I have a refinishing class running both days. A pause. She already confirmed with the client. That's a difficult position for her to be in. Commercial event prep space is available through several facilities in Hamilton. There's a good option near the Barton Street Industrial Corridor. Mum. The workshop is mine, Drew. It's committed. I'm sorry she made a promise she couldn't keep. He hung up with a quiet click. Not with anger, quite. With the flat resignation of a man who knew the conversation with Monica was going to be considerably worse than the one he'd just had with me. The next few weeks were chilly in the way that indicates someone has decided silence is a strategy. Monica went entirely quiet. Drew sent brief, functional texts. I focused on my classes, my van arrangement, my current refinishing commission. A set of 6 Edwardian dining chairs for a retired couple in Waterdown who had found me through a neighbor's recommendation. The house was quieter, but the quality of the quiet was different than the silence after Earl. That silence had been an absence. This one felt like space I had reclaimed. Then came Deirdre's retirement dinner. Deirdre had spent 30 years as a regional pharmaceutical sales representative, covering territories across Ontario and into Quebec. She had done extremely well. She lived in a newer subdivision in Ancaster in a house she owned outright, and she held a one-bedroom condo in downtown Hamilton she had purchased in 2016 and had been renting at market rate ever since. Currently, I understood, at just over $2,000 a month. She was 62, composed and impeccably put together in the way of women who have spent decades managing client relationships in boardrooms. I had always found her pleasant at family occasions. She and I inhabited different orbits that intersected politely at holidays and milestone events. The retirement dinner was at a restaurant on King Street West. Nice room, exposed brick, a wine list Monica consulted at length. I sat across from Deirdre and two of her friends from her sales territory days, and their conversation was warm and genuine. Deirdre was proud of what she had built. She had every reason to be. Midway through the evening, Monica stood up. She had a real gift for this, warm, assured, the words landing where she intended them. Mom built everything she has on her own, Monica said, one hand on Deirdre's shoulder. 30 years on the road through every kind of Ontario dense winter, every rental income check, every line of her retirement portfolio, she earned it. Her financial security is hers, completely and entirely. And nobody should ever feel entitled to reach into what someone else has worked that hard to build. The table applauded. Deirdre pressed Monica's hand and smiled with full and genuine pleasure. I raised my glass along with everyone else, and I meant it. Deirdre had worked hard, and that meant something. The principles Monica had just articulated were sound ones. What struck me as I set my glass down was how completely and sincerely Monica believed them. Later, when the server brought the bill in its leather folder, Deirdre slid her card out smoothly, paid her share, and began making her goodbyes. Monica glanced across at me, keeping her voice pleasantly light. Kathleen, Drew mentioned, you've been getting steady rental income from the van arrangement. Since you have the extra coming in, would you mind covering Drew's portion of the dinner? We're trying to hold back on discretionary spending this month. I looked at Monica. I looked at Deirdre, absorbed in warm goodbyes, her wallet comfortably returned to her bag. I'm happy to pay for my own meal, I said, and placed my portion of the bill plus a reasonable tip on the folder. Drew is 33. He's entirely capable of covering his. Monica's expression didn't shift much, just a faint tightening along the jaw. She said nothing further. The evening ended cordially. Driving home on the Lincoln-Alexander Parkway, I felt the familiar weight settle in my chest. Not anger at Monica, something more honest. A quiet grief about Drew, about how thoroughly he had receded inside that marriage. When Earl died, Drew had held my hand in the hospital corridor and told me we would look out for each other. I had believed him. I still wanted to believe him. What I had come to understand, gradually and without wanting to, was that looking out for each other had been quietly redefined somewhere along the way. My stability had become, in the operating logic of their household, a contingency fund available to be drawn upon whenever their own planning fell short. I went home and sat at the maple desk Earl had built. I pulled out my monthly ledger. The bungalow was fully paid. The Dundas market had been assessed at $640,000 the previous year. My teacher's PIN through OTPP paid reliably every month. My CPP was set to begin in the new year. I had an RRSP I had no intention of disturbing before it made practical sense. I was not wealthy, but I was genuinely secure. The kind of security that takes a very long time to construct and is very easy to dismantle if you allow other people to treat it as a shared resource. I called the lawyer I had used for Earl's estate and asked about formalizing my commercial van arrangement in writing and reviewing any liability considerations around workshop rental use. I wanted every commitment documented. No casual access, no assumed arrangements, nothing that could be claimed informally. I was not building a wall, I was being tidy. On the third Sunday of the following month, Drew texted to ask whether they could come for dinner. He said they had something they wanted to discuss about their housing situation. I replied that dinner would be at 6, and I would make the lamb. They arrived with a bottle of Niagara Red and a manila envelope. Monica had dressed with careful warmth, the look of someone about to make a presentation who wants to seem relaxed about it. Drew carried the envelope and set it on the edge of the counter without comment. The lamb was good. We talked about a development project Drew was coordinating in Binbrook and about the iced storm forecast for the following week. Monica remarked that properties in Dundas held their value exceptionally well. I noted this and said nothing. When I cleared the plates and brought coffee, Monica unsealed the envelope. She laid 3 pages on my kitchen table. The first was a printout from an online property valuation tool showing my address and a current estimate of $662,000. The second was a mortgage amortization spreadsheet, printed neatly in landscape format. The third was a home equity line of credit application with my name and Dundas address already entered in the relevant fields. "We want to be completely transparent with you," Monica said, hands folded on the tablecloth, voice measured and composed. "The townhouse we've been tracking in Stony Creek is listed at $690. To avoid CMHC mortgage insurance, we need 20% down. Roughly $138,000. We have $78,000 saved between the RRSP home buyers plan and what we've put aside. The gap is $60,000. I looked at the application with my address printed at the top. I did not reach for it. "And the solution you've come to is for me to borrow against my home. A HELOC on a fully paid property at your income level carries very low risk," Monica said, in the measured tone of someone presenting a proposal they have rehearsed. "You access $60,000, gift it to us as a down payment, and we service the interest payments on the line. You don't need to touch your RRSP or your pension income. The house carries the debt, not your personal cash flow." She said it as though debt secured against my house was somehow separate from debt I would carry. As though the bungalow Earl and I had paid for across 3 decades of careful, deliberate sacrifice was simply capital waiting to be put to better use. I looked at Drew. He was looking at the center of the table with focused attention, as though the grain of the maple had become suddenly important. "Drew," I said, "is this what you want?" He looked up, clearly startled to be addressed directly rather than spoken around. He rubbed one hand through his hair. "Mum, the rental market right now, if we don't get into something in the next few months, the school zone situation in Stony Creek." "I'm not asking about the market," I said quietly. "I'm asking whether this is what you want. Your name on that application. My house as the security." He was quiet for a long moment. "It makes sense on paper," he finally said. He did not look at me when he said it. I turned back to Monica. "Monica," I said. My voice was quite calm. "I want to ask you something." She nodded, still composed. "Your mother owns her home in Ancaster, fully paid off, with a market value comparable to mine. She has a downtown Hamilton condo generating rental income. She has a full retirement portfolio from 3 decades in pharmaceutical sales. You stood at her table 3 weeks ago and told everyone present that what she built is untouchable. That nobody should feel entitled to reach into what she's worked that hard for." Something shifted behind Monica's eyes, a very small movement, quickly controlled. "Have you gone to Deirdre with this application? Have you printed her property appraisal and asked her to put $60,000 of new debt against her home for your down payment?" The kitchen was completely silent. Monica's mouth opened. The composure she had maintained through the lamb and the wine and the entire presentation broke. Not loudly, but completely, the way ice goes in early spring. "That," she stopped. "That's entirely different, Kathleen. Help me understand how." "My mother is a single woman. She spent 30 years building that security. Those assets are her retirement. We would never ask her to put what she's earned at risk." I let that sit in the air for a moment. The clock on the kitchen wall counted 3 full seconds. "And what do you think I did for 29 years?" I asked. "Did Earl and I not work and budget and go without things we wanted to build exactly this security? Why is your mother's 30 years in pharmaceutical sales treated as sacred and protected, while my 30 years are treated as a communal resource you feel entitled to draw from Why does the same principle not apply to me? Monica looked down at the table. Her cheeks had gone deeply red. She had no answer. Not because she had considered the question and rejected it, but because the question had genuinely never occurred to her. The framework she was operating inside had never required the principle to run in both directions. She had simply, without examining it, assigned my stability a different category than her mother's. One was protected wealth. The other was available surplus. I picked up the 3 printed pages, straightened them against the table, and slid them back into the manila envelope. I won't be borrowing against my home, I said, looking at both of them. I won't be gifting or loaning money to fund a purchase you cannot support on your own incomes. You are both capable, employed adults. The path forward is to save for another year or two, or to find a property that fits your actual budget. That is not a punishment. That is how Earl and I bought this house. Drew reached across the table and picked up the envelope. He held it for a moment, then set it on the chair beside him. When he looked up, something in his face had changed. Not dramatically, not completely, but perceptibly. The quality of a man sitting with his own thoughts, for the first time in a while, instead of an extension of someone else's. They left 20 minutes later. Monica said goodbye at the front door without meeting my eyes. Drew paused on the step. "Thanks for the lamb, Mum," he said quietly. It wasn't an apology, but it was something real, and I held it carefully. I stood at the front window, after their headlights had turned out of the crescent, and watched the stillness settle back over the street. The workshop was a dark shape against the lighter dark of the escarpment. Earl had built it with reclaimed lumber he'd sourced himself, and the joints were tight enough that after 20 years nothing had shifted. The months after that dinner did not unfold the way I half expected. There was no retaliation, no pointed social media post, no carefully worded group text designed to recruit family opinion. Monica simply went quiet. Drew's messages on Sundays were brief at first, then gradually warmer, then eventually genuine. By October, he called to say they had found a townhouse in Waterdown, smaller than the Stony Creek listing, well within what their own income could carry, with a closing date in November. He said it plainly and without drama, but his voice had a different quality to it. A steadiness I hadn't heard from him in years. The sound of a man who had made a decision himself. The refinishing classes continued to fill. The Hamilton Artisan Collective asked whether I would consider leading a weekend intensive in the spring, and I said yes. My Thursday and Friday van arrangement renewed through the following year. I picked up 2 new commissions from the Ancaster client's neighbors when I delivered her secretary desk. The house, once too quiet after Earl, was full of productive company on my own terms. Students learning to use a card scraper, the smell of linseed oil and beeswax on Saturday mornings, the satisfaction of a piece of furniture brought back from what looked like ruin. On a Saturday in late November, I walked out to the workshop before the first class arrived. The light came through the high windows in the particular way of late autumn in Hamilton. Long, angled, specific. I stood in the middle of the room for a moment and thought about what it had actually cost to own it outright. Not in dollars, though I knew those numbers precisely. In years. In the choices that were made and the ones that were deferred. In the trust that Earl and I had placed in each other across 3 decades of ordinary life. There are people who will tell you that security is selfish, that equity sitting in a paid-off house is a moral failure, that a woman living alone in a 3-bedroom home with a workshop and a van should feel the weight of that as an obligation to others. I have thought about this carefully. I have asked myself more than once whether I was wrong to hold firm. And then I remember Monica standing at that restaurant table in King Street West with her hand on her mother's shoulder, saying that what Deirdre had built over 30 years, nobody should feel entitled to touch. She meant it completely. She simply hadn't noticed that the sentence needed to end the same way in every direction. Or it meant nothing at all. 2 springs later, Drew called me from the maternity ward at Hamilton Health Sciences at 4 in the morning. His voice was broken open in the good way, the overwhelmed way. "Mum, twins, you have to come." I drove through the dark with a thermos of tea and found him in the waiting area off the main corridor, still in his jacket, unable to sit still. We talked about Earl, who would have been absurd with joy about twins. We talked about the names they had chosen. Drew held my hand without saying anything for a long time, and I did not require him to say anything. What I thought about, sitting in that waiting room in the early morning, was the difference between obligation and love. Obligation says you have it, therefore it belongs to me. Love says, what is mine I built honestly, and what I give freely, and those are not the same thing, and a person who cannot tell the difference cannot be trusted with either. Earl built the workshop from salvaged lumber with his own hands, and it has stood without shifting for 20 years. I have taken good care of it. It is mine. Not in the hoarding sense, not in the precious sense, but in the true and complete sense of something that was earned and that will be given on my own terms, in my own time, to the people and purposes I choose. The light over the escarpment is good in every season. I am not finished yet.